Welcome to my PowerPoint presentation on why Knockout is a bad perk in Dead by Daylight. Survivors are inflicted with a 5% hindered penalty for 5 seconds if they drop a pallet and move more than 6 meters away within 6 seconds of dropping it. Knockout is a shell of its former self both in strength and its thematic design. Knockout used to be a pro slugging perk in which the auras of dying survivors were concealed from their teammates unless they were within a short distance of that survivor. Knockout was changed in patch 8.6.0 due to some players abusing the perk to force a 4-man slug instead of achieving victory through the intended gameplay loop of hooking and sacrificing. While the viability of the strategy could be questioned, it was nonetheless a slow and tedious experience and was more so intended to annoy other players than win. The reworked version, however, is rather weak. It has fairly strict activation conditions with limited bonuses. In order to garner its effect, it's entirely dependent on how survivors choose to play. Playing loops normally will usually not trigger the hindered effect. What does trigger the effect, however, is pre-dropping and running to the next loop. Of the few ways to force this, such as breaking the pallet or using a particular killer power, you'll be slowed down such that the purpose is defeated. Even if you manage to get the perk to work, the hindered effect is not strong enough nor lasts long enough to see real impact. The math works out that the survivor loses 1 meter of distance. That is a quarter second of survivor running. While Dead by Daylight can be very frame-focused, in which the slightest bits of distance or action speeds can make a world of difference, it's unlikely that this will prevent a survivor from reaching the next loop, especially if you break the pallet. Perhaps the hindered would be more pronounced if it triggered when a survivor lingered near a loop, because it could then offset the perimeter difference of loops due to the differing sizes of survivor and killer hitboxes. Of course, the trade-off is that it would promote pre-dropping, so there's not really a good answer here. I suppose it still works mechanically with Bubba, as he can eat pallets and force survivors to leave the loop to activate the perk, but beyond that I no longer see any connection of the effect to the name nor the flavor text. The best I can come up with is that the survivor somehow hits themselves in the head with the pallet or something. I don't know. I've come up with 2 reworks to bring Knockout back to something that makes sense. The first version returns it to a slugging perk. Now, you might be scared, but I don't think Knockout was necessarily a problematic perk in it being pro-slugging. The issue that it had in my eyes was that it was a permanent debuff to that dying survivor with a lack of intuitive restrictions that still allowed for counterplay. It was extremely difficult for survivors to bounce back unless they had third-party communications. The version I made triggers when you down a survivor with your basic attack. That survivor's scream is suppressed, requiring survivors to pay more attention to their teammates and the HUD. Additionally, other survivors within 32 meters of that downed survivor are inflicted with blindness and exhausted for a short duration. This replicates the aura concealing effect that the old version had, but has limitations to prevent the perk from becoming a solo queue stomper. The aura concealing being relegated to the blindness status makes the debuff temporary, and the range limit only affect those who may be hovering for a save. The exhausted effect can hinder rescues in the form of background player or sprint burst, as well as helping to catch your next victim if they lurk too close by. Lastly, if you are near a pallet when you down the survivor, your basic attack cooldown is reduced by 30%. This replicates the micrometers of distance making the difference that the current version seems to champion. Sometimes when a survivor is downed, the weapon wipe animation can allow them to crawl just far enough to a pallet that they can be saved by another survivor. This enables you to pick them up quicker, both potentially preventing them from crawling to a pallet and tightening the window for a rescuer to make a save. I don't think this would be a meta perk by any means, but I can only do so much. The second version leans more into the name Knockout. Very simply, survivors become exposed at the start of the trial, and any subsequent exposed effect has a prolonged duration. This can enable a strong start to a match as well as synergize with many other perks. Starting the trial exposed can be a little daunting, so I could see how this could become a problem. In any case, the way it inflicts exposed could be changed, and the intended effect was the prolonged exposed synergies. I was mostly just following Lethal Pursuer's design philosophy, and it was a little hard to come up with new ways for survivors to become exposed without overlapping other perks. This version is a little underbaked, but I wanted to give an alternative for those who do not want to see a slugging version of this perk. Thanks for watching, leave a like, and put your thoughts in the comments below.